My husband's best friend came out of our bathroom holding abortion medication and said, "I thought you guys were trying for a baby." I looked up from my laptop where I'd been researching IVF clinics. "We are trying, Zane. What are you talking about?" Beside me, my husband Jasper froze mid-reach for his coffee. Zane held up an orange prescription bottle. "Then why do you have mifepristone? This is abortion medication. It terminates pregnancies." I laughed nervously. "That's not mine. I would never, Jasper. Is this yours?" The silence was deafening. Zane looked between us, realization dawning on his face. "There's only 2 people who live here," I said as Zane started reading the prescription label. "Filled last month and the month before." My stomach dropped. "My miscarriages," I whispered. "I've had 4 miscarriages in 23 months. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking. "You've been poisoning me? You've been killing our babies?" Jasper backed against the counter, his face gray. "It's not what you think." "Then explain why abortion medication is in our house while I'm taking fertility supplements," I said, my voice rising, "while I inject myself with hormones, while I've been blaming my body for failing us. You called our children," the words came out raw, broken. "Your mother called me defective at Thanksgiving, asked if maybe we should explore other options. Your sister announced her 3rd pregnancy at Christmas and everyone looked at me with pity." My voice was rising even more. "I refused my promotion to reduce stress. I gave up coffee, wine, sushi, even my anxiety medication to increase the odds." Jasper opened his mouth. "The doctor said stress could—" "Don't you dare!" I cut him off. "Don't you dare quote the doctors to me." Zane stood frozen. "I did 3 rounds of Clomid that made me so sick I couldn't work. They shot dye through my fallopian tubes. Do you know how much that hurts, Jasper? While you were poisoning me, I was letting doctors torture me to find out why I couldn't stay pregnant. We named our babies," I continued, tears streaming now. "You remember how we picked them out together? Phoenix, Sage, Indigo, Xavier. I was knitting their baby blankets while you were making sure they'd never need them." Jasper's hands were trembling, reaching out like he was the one who needed comfort. Zane's face suddenly went whiter than it had been. "Jasper, is this about Sloan?" Jasper went white. "Who's Sloan?" I asked. "She's nobody, just someone from work. I saw you leaving work together late last month." Zane cut him off. "You looked like you were flirting." Her hand was on your neck. Jasper's face started visibly shaking. "When I asked you about it, you said it was a work project. I believed you because I didn't take my best friend for a cheater," Zane continued. "But the way you're shaking makes me doubt that." I grabbed Jasper's phone from the counter. "You said she's nobody, so you won't mind me looking." The text with Sloan loaded immediately. Hearts, kiss emojis. "Can't wait until you're finally free." I scrolled up with shaking hands. "Did the insurance pay out yet?" My blood went cold. "Insurance?" I kept reading. $8,000 this time, same as the last 3. Perfect. Almost enough for the lawyer and apartment deposit. 1 more should do it. She wants to try again next month. Perfect timing. I read the next one aloud, my voice breaking. "Making her dead babies pay for our future." Jasper's knees buckled with embarrassment. He gripped the counter to stay standing. "You've been collecting money from our dead children?" I could barely breathe. "Pregnancy loss insurance through your work. I didn't even know that existed." $8,000 per miscarriage. $32,000. I kept scrolling, finding worse with every swipe. "You texted her from the hospital. While I was miscarrying Indigo, you wrote 1 more after this and we're free. You held my hand through contractions while planning the next murder." "I never meant for it to hurt you like," Jasper started. "You didn't mean to hurt me?" I screamed. "The pregnancy tests," I snapped, everything clicking. "You always brought them home, insisted on watching me take them. You knew exactly when I was pregnant so you could start poisoning me. You controlled the timeline of when each baby would die so it would never look suspicious." I threw his phone at him. "You let me believe I was broken. Let your mother suggest you deserved a real woman who could give you children. You even agreed with her, then said you'd love me anyway, like you were doing me a favor." Zane already had his phone out. "I'm calling police." Jasper reached for me. "Please, let me explain." "Explain what? How you culled our babies for money? How you poisoned me to afford your girlfriend?" I backed away from him. "I used our savings for fertility treatments while you were collecting death benefits." I looked at this man I'd loved for 7 years. Every night I prayed for a baby. Every morning I gave myself injections that made me gain 30 pounds. Your response? You said I was less attractive, remember? While you were poisoning me to be with Sloan. Jasper's mouth moved, but no words came out, like even he couldn't find a lie big enough for this. Zane was on the phone with police giving our address. Phoenix would have been 2 now, I said quietly. Sage would be walking. Indigo would be 3 months old, but to you they were just transactions. $8,000 each. Sirens in the distance. Jasper stood there, unable to speak. "I wanted to be a mother," I whispered, "and you knew that. You watched me destroy myself trying." The sirens got louder. "They're coming for you," I said, "and I hope Sloan was worth it." I saw Jasper's eyes dart around, and before I knew it, he was making a run for it out back. Zane just held me while I cried. The front door exploded open and 3 officers rushed in with their hands on their weapons. Zane's arms dropped from around me and I pointed toward the back door still swinging on its hinges. 2 officers sprinted through the kitchen and out into the yard while the 3rd one stayed with us. My whole body was shaking so hard I could barely stand. The officer kept asking what happened, but the words wouldn't come out right. I just kept pointing at the prescription bottle on the counter and sobbing. Zane picked up Jasper's phone from where it had landed on the floor and handed it to the officer. The screen was still showing those awful texts about making dead babies pay for their future. The officer's face went from confused to horrified as he scrolled through the messages. He pulled out his radio and called for evidence bags and a crime scene team. More sirens were getting closer, and soon paramedics came through the door with their equipment bags. They took one look at me shaking and crying and immediately started checking my vitals. My blood pressure was 180/110 and my pulse was racing at 140. The paramedic said I needed to go to the emergency room right away. She explained that being poisoned repeatedly for almost 2 years could have caused serious damage we couldn't see. Zane said he would drive me and helped me stand up. My legs felt like jelly and I had to lean on him to walk. The officer said detectives would meet us at the hospital to take my statement. Outside there were 4 police cars now with lights flashing. Neighbors were standing on their porches watching. I saw Mrs. Henderson from next door with her hand over her mouth. Zane helped me into his car and we drove to the hospital in silence except for my occasional sobs. At the emergency room, they took me straight back when Zane explained about the poisoning. The triage nurse's eyes went wide when she heard about the mifepristone. They put me in a room and a doctor came in within minutes. I told her everything about the 4 miscarriages and finding out Jasper had been giving me abortion medication. She ordered blood work, urine tests, liver function tests, and an ultrasound to check for organ damage. A nurse came in to draw what felt like 20 vials of blood. Then another nurse came with a camera to photograph me for evidence. She took pictures of my face, my arms where all the IV marks were from the miscarriages, and my swollen belly from the fertility drugs. They said everything would be documented for the police report. I could hear Zane out in the waiting room on his phone. Later, he told me he was calling in sick to work and texting our friend group about what happened. He kept telling people people he should have said something when he saw Jasper with Sloan. He looked destroyed by guilt when I saw him between tests. After about 2 hours, a detective arrived at the hospital. Detective Lionel McAllister was a tall man with kind eyes who introduced himself as the lead investigator. He had a laptop and started typing as I told him everything from the beginning. How we'd been trying for a baby for almost 2 years. The 4 miscarriages that destroyed me. The fertility treatments that cost our entire savings. Finding the prescription bottle today. The texts about the insurance money. Jasper running when the police were coming. Detective McAllister asked detailed questions about dates and times and medical records. He gave me his business card with his direct cell phone number. He said they needed my consent to search the house thoroughly. I signed the form immediately. He explained they would be collecting everything from the kitchen and all medications from the house. They'd already put out an alert for Jasper's car and frozen his credit cards and bank accounts. He said Jasper wouldn't get far. After the detective left, a social worker came to my room. She was an older woman with gentle hands who sat down and explained that reproductive coercion was a recognized form of domestic abuse. She gave me pamphlets about emergency protective orders and victim resources. She said what Jasper did was attempted murder, fraud, and domestic violence all rolled into one. She helped me fill out paperwork for an emergency restraining order right there in the hospital bed. The doctor came back with my test results around 9 that night. I'm trying to understand how someone could plan something so awful. Jasper was actually timing when to give her the medication based on her pregnancy tests. My liver enzymes were elevated from the repeated poisoning. She said it would take months to know the full extent of the damage. She prescribed medications to help my liver heal and gave me referrals to specialists. She said I was lucky Zane found that bottle when he did. Another pregnancy with Jasper poisoning me could have killed me. They discharged me around 10:30 with a stack of papers and follow-up appointments. Zane drove me to his apartment since the police said our house was a crime scene. I couldn't go back for at least 48 hours while they processed evidence. Zane's apartment was small but clean. He set me up in his guest room with fresh sheets and towels. He made chamomile tea and sat with me while I stared at the wall. Everything felt surreal, like this was happening to someone else. My phone kept buzzing with calls and texts from people who'd heard. I couldn't deal with any of it. At midnight, I called my boss because I knew I couldn't go to work tomorrow or probably for weeks. She could hear in my voice that something terrible had happened. I just said there was a family emergency and I needed time off. She told me to take whatever time I needed and that HR would send paperwork for family medical leave. I hung up and just sat there on Zane's couch staring at nothing until I finally fell asleep around 3 in the morning. When I woke up a few hours later, my first thought was that maybe it had all been some horrible nightmare. But then I saw the white hospital bracelet still on my wrist from when they'd taken me in for tests. The reality hit me all over again and I barely made it to Zane's bathroom before I started throwing up. I stayed there on the cold tile floor for almost an hour, just dry heaving and crying until there was nothing left. Zane knocked softly and brought me water and a wet washcloth, but I couldn't even look at him because I was so embarrassed about falling apart like this. My phone started ringing around 9, and when I saw it was a blocked number, I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The detective's voice was calm and professional as he told me they'd found the prescription bottle at our house and tracked down records showing Jasper had been getting refills from 3 different pharmacies using different doctors. He said the insurance company had already opened their own investigation into the fraud and would probably want to talk to me soon. After I hung up, I remembered I had a fertility appointment scheduled for that afternoon, so I called the clinic to cancel. When I started explaining why I couldn't come in, the nurse got really quiet and then said she needed to transfer me to someone else. The next person who picked up said she was from their legal department and that they were flagging my file immediately. She said they'd provide all my medical records to support the criminal case and asked if I had a lawyer yet. I hadn't even thought about needing a lawyer. Around noon, my phone rang again, and this time it was someone named Alicia Mead from my employer's insurance department. Her voice was professional, but I could hear the shock underneath as she asked me to give a recorded statement about the pregnancy loss claims that had been filed. I spent 40 minutes going through each miscarriage and when it happened and how much money had been paid out while she typed everything up. She kept saying things like, "I'm so sorry," and "This is unbelievable," even though she was trying to stay professional. After that call, I opened my laptop and started going through our bank statements because I needed to see the proof for myself. The deposits were right there, plain as day. $8,000 appearing in our joint account after each miscarriage, and then immediately transferred to another account that only had Jasper's name on it. The dates matched up perfectly with when I'd lost each baby. I took screenshots of everything and emailed them to myself and to the detective. My phone rang again, and when I saw it was Jasper's mother, I almost didn't answer, but then decided to see what she had to say. She didn't even wait for me to say hello before she started screaming about how I was ruining her son's life with my lies and hysteria, and how dare I involve the police in a private family matter. She said I'd always been unstable and this proved it, and that Jasper was better off without me. I hung up on her, but not before I'd recorded the whole thing on Zane's phone. I forwarded the recording to the detective and then blocked her number and her husband's number and Jasper's sister's number too because I knew they'd all be calling next. 3 days passed in a blur of police interviews and phone calls with lawyers and insurance investigators. Then an email popped up from an address I didn't recognize, but when I opened it, I knew right away it was from Jasper. He was writing to say this was all a huge misunderstanding and begging me to call off the police before things went too far. He actually had the nerve to claim the medication was to help manage my miscarriages, not cause them. Like I was stupid enough to believe that. He said he'd been trying to spare me more pain by ending the pregnancies early when he could tell they weren't viable. Reading his lies made me so sick I had to run to the bathroom again. The next day I had an appointment with a reproductive specialist that the detective had recommended to assess the damage. The doctor went through my whole medical history and explained how the repeated exposure to mifepristone could have caused serious damage to my uterus and cervix. She ordered a bunch of specialized tests and blood work and warned me that my future fertility might be permanently affected. She said she'd seen cases like this before, but never where it was deliberate poisoning by a spouse. While I was at the doctor's office, Zane was at the police station giving his formal statement about seeing Jasper with Sloan. He showed them photos on his phone from when he'd seen them together at a restaurant last month when Jasper had told me he was at a client dinner. In one photo, you could see Sloan's hand on Jasper's neck, and they were clearly sitting way too close to just be co-workers. Zane also told them about how Jasper had lied when he'd asked about it and said it was just a work project. The detective called me that afternoon with an update that made everything even worse. The forensics team had tested our coffee maker and found mifepristone residue in the water reservoir and filter. They'd also tested the vitamin supplements Jasper had been giving me for stress and found the pills had been opened and resealed with the medication mixed in. The detective said this proved it wasn't isolated incidents but deliberate poisoning over an extended period of time. 3 days Days later, I was sitting in a waiting room that smelled like vanilla candles and old magazines, my hands wrapped around a paper cup of water that kept shaking. The therapist's door opened and a woman with gray hair pulled back in a bun called my name. Elise Meredith had an office full of plants and soft chairs that made you sink when you sat down. She listened while I told her everything, starting with the prescription bottle and ending with the coffee maker. When I finished, she leaned forward and said the words I needed to hear. She called it attempted murder, not just betrayal. We spent the rest of the hour making a safety plan with specific steps like changing my locks and getting a new phone number. My hands finally stopped shaking when she wrote down the crisis hotline number and made me promise to call if I felt unsafe. The next morning, the detective called and asked me to come to the station. They'd pulled our home security footage from the cloud backup I'd forgotten we even had. The timestamp showed Jasper coming home with pharmacy bags on January 15th, March 3rd, May 20th, and July 8th. Each date was exactly 2 days before I lost a baby. The worst part was watching him on the kitchen camera, adding white powder to my morning smoothie while I was still in bed. He'd stir it carefully, wash the spoon, then bring it to me with a kiss on my forehead. The detective had to pause the video when I started throwing up in their trash can. They gave me ginger ale and crackers while explaining they'd found more evidence on Jasper's devices. He'd been using encrypted messaging apps with Sloan, trying to delete everything after I confronted him. Their tech team was working on recovery, but said it might take weeks to get everything back. The detective wrote down every detail in his notebook while I sat there feeling like my whole life was evidence now. I started looking for apartments that same week because I couldn't sleep in that house anymore. Every showing felt wrong, like I was watching someone else walk through empty rooms and ask about lease terms. The first place was too expensive. The second one faced a playground where kids were always screaming and laughing. The third had a kitchen that looked exactly like ours, and I had to leave before the agent finished talking about the dishwasher. I finally found a one-bedroom above a bakery that smelled like bread every morning. The landlord didn't ask questions when I couldn't provide a reference from my current address. 2 weeks after that, the district attorney's office called. Vincent Milligan had a voice like gravel and kept clearing his throat while he explained they were building 2 cases. One for poisoning, one for insurance fraud. He said the evidence was strong, but warned me the process would take months, maybe longer. They'd need me to testify, to relive everything in front of strangers who would judge whether my pain was real enough for justice. He gave me a victim advocate's number and said to call if I needed anything, but we both knew what I needed was impossible to get back. The divorce papers arrived the next day. Jasper's lawyer claimed I was having a mental breakdown and making false accusations. What makes someone document their own crimes so carefully? The security footage showing Jasper mixing powder into smoothies while she slept. Did he forget about their cameras or just think he'd never get caught? They wanted control of our assets, said I was too unstable to make financial decisions. My hands shook with rage as I read his claims that I was delusional, that I'd imagined everything because of grief. He even suggested I needed psychiatric evaluation before any divorce proceedings could move forward. The papers felt heavy in my hands, like holding proof that he was still trying to destroy me even from jail. I hired Cyrus McQueen that afternoon after calling 6 other lawyers who said my case was too complicated. He cost more than I made in 3 months, but promised to fight every single lie Jasper was spreading. The first thing he did was file for a protective order and freeze our joint accounts before Jasper could empty them. He had me write down everything I remembered while he took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he looked at me over his glasses and said we were going to bury Jasper in court. Work sent FMLA paperwork the following week. My manager called to check in, her voice careful like she was afraid I might break. She said to take all the time I needed, but we both knew my performance review was coming up. The promotion I'd turned down to reduce stress felt like another thing Jasper stole from me. I filled out the forms at my new kitchen table, writing family medical emergency in the reason box because there wasn't a checkbox for husband murdered my babies. 3 weeks into living in my new apartment, I ran into Sloan at the grocery store. She was buying pregnancy tests. The irony made me want to scream, but instead I pulled out my phone and started recording. She walked right up to me, had the nerve to touch my arm and say she had no idea what Jasper was doing. Her voice was high and fake sweet as she insisted they were together, but she thought I knew about the affair. She said Jasper told her we had an arrangement, that our marriage was just for show. She kept talking while I recorded, admitted they'd been together for 8 months, said he promised to leave me after the holidays. When she finally noticed my phone, her face went white and she practically ran to her car. The blood test results came back the next day. The doctor called to explain they'd found traces of mifepristone metabolites still in my system 5 weeks after the last poisoning. She said it proved repeated exposure over time, that my body had been saturated with a drug. The documentation would be crucial for the criminal case, she said, then asked if I needed a referral for counseling. I almost laughed because I was already seeing Elise twice a week, and it still wasn't enough to make sense of any of this. 2 weeks passed in a blur of police interviews and medical tests before I got the call. The detective's voice was flat when he told me they'd pulled Jasper over for a broken taillight 3 states away. He'd been living in his car, hadn't shaved in days, and started crying when they cuffed him. The booking photo they sent me showed someone I barely recognized. His eyes were hollow, and his clothes were wrinkled and stained. I stared at that photo for an hour, waiting to feel something besides empty. Zane kept asking if I was okay, but I couldn't answer because I didn't know. The bail hearing happened 3 days later in a courtroom that smelled like old coffee and floor cleaner. Jasper's mother sat in the front row wearing her church dress and shooting daggers at me with her eyes. When the judge set bail at $200,000, she stood up and wrote a check without hesitation. She'd refinanced her house, the bailiff told me later. The judge granted my request for a restraining order, but I knew that piece of paper wouldn't stop Jasper if he really wanted to hurt me. His mother cornered me in the hallway afterward and hissed that I was destroying her son's life over nothing. I walked away without responding because what could I say to a woman who thought poisoning babies was nothing? The next week, Elise suggested I try a pregnancy loss support group that met at the community center on Tuesdays. I sat in that circle of plastic chairs for 20 minutes before I could speak. When I finally said the words out loud about what Jasper did, the room went completely silent. One woman started crying and another reached over to hold my hand. They believed me without question, which was more than I could say for most people. After the meeting, 3 of them gave me their phone numbers and said to call anytime. I saved them in my phone but couldn't bring myself to reach out yet. The detective called while I was grocery shopping 4 days later. They'd gotten Sloan's phone records and found hundreds of texts between her and Jasper about the insurance money. She'd known everything from the beginning and helped him plan each poisoning. The prosecutor had offered her a deal to testify against him, and she'd taken it immediately. No loyalty among murderers, apparently. I had to abandon my cart in the cereal aisle and sit in my car for an hour after that call. The next morning, I stopped at my usual coffee shop for the first time since everything happened. A pregnant woman was ordering at the counter, her hand resting on her round belly. My chest got tight and I couldn't breathe. The walls started closing in, and my vision went dark around the edges. I stumbled to my car and used the breathing exercises Elise had taught me. Count to 4, breathing in, hold for 4, out for 4. It took 15 minutes before I could drive home. My lawyer Vincent called that afternoon with news that made me want to scream. Jasper was claiming the mifepristone was prescribed by a doctor for his own medical condition. Some rare thing where men supposedly need it, which was complete garbage. We spent the next 6 hours going through every medical record I had from the past 3 years. Not a single prescription for that drug existed in my files. Vincent said we'd need to subpoena Jasper's medical records to prove he was lying. The insurance company called the next day, and Alicia's voice was all business. They were denying all 4 claims Jasper had filed and demanding repayment of $32,000 plus interest. They were also filing criminal charges for insurance fraud on top of everything else. She said they took fraud very seriously and would pursue this to the fullest extent. Good, I thought. Let him face consequences from every direction. Zane drove me back to the house a week later to pack my things. I'd been staying with him since that first night and couldn't put off getting my stuff any longer. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, my whole body started shaking. This was where he'd poisoned me every morning, mixing that drug into my prenatal smoothies while kissing my forehead. I threw up in the sink while Zane rubbed my back. We grabbed clothes and important papers and left everything else behind. I couldn't stand being in those rooms where I'd been so happy and so stupid. My phone started blowing up with messages that night from people I thought were friends. Jasper had been posting on social media about how I was having a mental breakdown and making up horrible lies. Some people believed him and sent me messages saying I needed help. Others just wanted gossip and asked for details like this was entertainment. I deleted every social media account I had after reading one post that said I was obviously lying because what husband would do something so evil? The prosecutor brought in a forensic toxicologist the following week to review my case. She spent 3 hours explaining how the poisoning pattern showed careful planning. Each dose was calculated to end the pregnancy while keeping me alive, which required specific medical knowledge. The spacing between poisonings was designed to look like natural miscarriages. She said whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing and how to make it look like bad luck. The prosecutor recorded everything for the trial. 2 weeks later, I was shoving boxes into the back of Zane's truck while rain soaked through my jacket. The apartment I found was across town in a building that smelled like old carpet and had water stains on the ceiling. Zane carried my couch up 3 flights of stairs without complaining, even though I could see his face turning red from the effort. We worked in silence mostly because every time he tried to talk, his voice would crack and he'd look away. When we got the bed frame assembled, he sat on the floor and stared at his hands. He kept opening his mouth like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. Finally, he managed to tell me he should have said something when he saw Jasper with Sloan. I told him it wasn't his fault, but he shook his head and said he'd been a coward. After that, we set up some rules about how often he could check on me because his guilt was making him text me every hour. The next morning, Vincent called to say Jasper's lawyer wanted to meet about a plea deal. I drove to Vincent's office where the walls were covered in law degrees and pictures of him shaking hands with important-looking people. Jasper's lawyer sat across from us with a folder full of papers and started talking about reduced charges if I agreed not to sue for damages. Vincent listened without interrupting, then leaned back in his chair and told the lawyer the evidence was too strong for us to consider any deals. The lawyer kept pushing and said Jasper would plead to simple assault instead of poisoning. Vincent actually laughed and said the grand jury would never accept that. 3 days after that meeting, I had to go to the divorce mediation in a conference room that overlooked the city. Jasper sat at the other end of the table looking thinner than before with dark circles under his eyes. His lawyer started reading from prepared notes about how the marriage assets should be divided. Then Jasper's lawyer said, since I made more money than Jasper, I should pay him support. My lawyer Cyrus stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. Cyrus standing up so fast his chair hit the wall. Now that's a lawyer who knows when to show real anger. How does someone even suggest the victim should pay their poisoner? He pulled out tax returns showing I'd only made more money the last 2 years while Jasper had been the higher earner for 5 years before that. Cyrus also pointed out that Jasper had been stealing from me through insurance fraud, so any claim for support was ridiculous. Jasper's lawyer tried to argue, but Cyrus shut him down with case law and precedents until they dropped the support request. The following Monday, I went back to work, but only for half days because I couldn't focus on anything. I kept making mistakes on reports I'd done hundreds of times before. My supervisor found me crying in the bathroom after I sent an email to the wrong client list. She told me to take my time and that everyone understood what I was going through. But I knew my career was basically over because I couldn't concentrate long enough to do the simplest tasks. My hands would shake when I tried to type, and I'd forget what I was doing in the middle of projects. A week later, Vincent called to say Sloan had taken a deal with the prosecution. She gave them everything, including texts where Jasper called the babies financial opportunities and calculated how much money each one would bring. She showed them messages where he planned exactly when to give me the medicine based on my cycle. There were emails where they discussed apartment listings and how they'd use the insurance money for deposits and furniture. Sloan even had recordings of phone calls where Jasper laughed about how I blamed myself for the miscarriages. Vincent said her testimony was devastating and would basically guarantee a conviction. The worst day came when I had to go to the prosecutor's office to identify evidence. They brought out clear plastic bags with the baby blankets I'd been knitting. The yellow one for Phoenix still had the needles in it where I'd stopped mid-row. The green one for Sage was almost finished except for the border. The purple one for Indigo was just started with only a few inches done. The blue one for Xavier was complete, and I remembered wrapping it in tissue paper thinking maybe this time we'd get to use it. The prosecutor asked me to confirm these were mine, and I could barely speak to say yes. They also had the pregnancy journals I'd kept with notes about symptoms and hopes for each baby. Seeing all of it labeled as evidence with case numbers made me realize those babies were never going to be anything more than evidence in a criminal case. 2 weeks after that, the grand jury met, and Vincent called me that afternoon to say they'd indicted Jasper on all charges. He was facing assault with poison, insurance fraud, and domestic violence charges that could mean 20 years in prison. Vincent said it was one of the strongest cases he'd seen because of all the evidence and Sloan's testimony, but he warned me that trials were unpredictable, and Jasper's lawyer would try everything to create doubt. He said we needed to prepare for a long fight, and that Jasper might still try to take a plea deal as the trial got closer. The next week, I had an appointment with my fertility doctor who ran a bunch of tests to see what damage the medicine had done. She came back with mixed results showing some scarring, but not complete infertility. She said I might still be able to have children, but recommended waiting at least a year before trying to let my body heal. She also said the emotional trauma needed time to process before I'd I'd be ready to try again. I left her office feeling numb because I didn't know if I'd ever want to try again after everything that happened. While dealing with all the legal stuff, I started getting mail I didn't recognize. Credit card statements for cards I'd never opened with balances of thousands of dollars. I called the companies and they said the cards were in my name with my social security number. The charges were for jewelry, electronics, and cash advances totaling $30,000. I took everything to Cyrus, who filed fraud paperwork, but said it would take months to resolve, and I might have to pay some of it while we fought. He found applications Jasper had forged with my signature and submitted proof to the credit companies, but they moved slowly. Yesterday morning, I got to work and found a huge flower arrangement on my desk with a note in Jasper's handwriting begging for forgiveness. Security cameras showed the delivery person, but not who ordered them. I called the police to report the restraining order violation, but they said without proof Jasper ordered them, they could only give him a warning. Security walked me to my car after work and said they'd watch for any more deliveries. The flowers went straight in the dumpster, but I could still smell them on my hands even after washing them 5 times. 6 months crawled by before I found myself in my apartment lighting 4 small candles on what would have been Indigo's first birthday. The vanilla scent filled my living room while I sat on the floor naming each flame out loud for Phoenix, Sage, Indigo, and Xavier. My hands shook setting up the last candle, but I managed to get through singing happy birthday without completely falling apart. The cake I'd bought sat untouched on the coffee table next to 4 tiny wrapped boxes containing baby socks I couldn't stop myself from buying. I blew out each candle one by one and whispered their names into the smoke. The divorce papers came through 2 weeks later, and my lawyer explained how Jasper's criminal actions meant our prenup kicked in hard. I got the house, both cars, our savings, and the retirement accounts, while he got stuck with over $40,000 in legal fees and nothing else. The paperwork showed his signature shaky and uneven where he'd signed from county jail. I signed my name steady and clear, then went home and changed the locks, even though he couldn't get out anyway. 3 months after that, I sat in a cold room at the courthouse waiting to testify before the grand jury. They made me describe each miscarriage in detail, while Jasper sat 20 feet away in his orange jumpsuit watching me. His lawyer kept interrupting to ask if I was sure about dates and times, trying to make me look confused or like I was lying. I pulled out my journal where I'd written everything down and read the entries word for word about the cramping, the bleeding, the emergency room visits, the D&C procedures. When his lawyer asked if maybe the miscarriages were natural, I pointed at the prescription bottle evidence and asked him to explain why abortion medication was in my prenatal vitamins. The grand jury indicted on all charges within an hour. Elise met me at her office the next week to help write my victim impact statement for sentencing. She had tissues ready and a recorder, so I could speak instead of write when my hands got too shaky. I named each baby and described the nursery I'd started planning 4 different times. I talked about the baby clothes I'd hidden in the closet that I still couldn't bring myself to donate. I mentioned the stretch marks on my stomach that proved those pregnancies were real, even though Jasper tried to erase them. We practiced reading it together until I could get through without my voice breaking completely. The plea deal news came through Vincent's office a month later, and I threw my phone across the room when I heard 5 years with possible parole in 3. Vincent explained on speaker that it was actually a good outcome for a poisoning case where the victims technically never drew breath according to the law. I screamed that they were real babies to me and hung up on him. The sentencing hearing happened 2 weeks after that in a packed courtroom. I read my statement while Jasper's mother wailed dramatically in the gallery, and his sister shot daggers at me with her eyes. The judge nodded along and said he understood my pain, but had to follow the plea agreement the prosecution accepted. Jasper stood up and mumbled something about being sorry, but the judge cut him off and told him to save it. I walked out feeling empty while his family shouted that I'd ruined his life. My lawyer filed the civil suit for emotional distress and battery the same week, warning me it would take years and I'd probably never see a penny from someone doing time. I signed the papers anyway because I wanted it on record forever what he'd done. The insurance company moved faster with their own lawsuit and won $50,000 including penalties and interest that Jasper would owe whenever he got out. Their lawyer called it a slam dunk case of insurance fraud and said they'd garnish any wages he ever earned. Small comfort when my arms stayed empty every night. 6 months into his sentence, I started volunteering with a domestic violence group, telling my story to rooms full of women who nodded along with recognition in their eyes. Some of them had bruises, but others had invisible wounds like mine from partners who found creative ways to control and hurt them. The coordinator said reproductive coercion was more common than people realized, and my story helped others recognize the signs. One woman came up after crying because her husband had been messing with her birth control, and she thought she was going crazy. A full year after that first moment with Zane holding up the prescription bottle, I sat in Elise's office for our monthly session. The panic attacks had gone from daily to maybe once a week, usually triggered by baby commercials or pregnancy announcements on social media. I'd gone back to work full-time and even taken the promotion I'd turned down before, throwing myself into 12-hour days that kept my mind busy. My coworkers had stopped walking on eggshells around me, and I could make it through most days without crying in the bathroom. The grocery store baby aisle still made me leave my cart and run for the parking lot sometimes, but Elise said that was normal and might never fully go away. I'd started dating again, just coffee meetings that never went anywhere because I'd eventually have to explain why I flinched when they mentioned wanting kids someday. How does someone document their own evil like that? Those texts where Jasper called the babies financial opportunities. I wonder if he typed those words without any feeling at all, just calculating numbers while she was dreaming of holding them. The grief hadn't gotten smaller, but I'd gotten better at carrying it, like a heavy backpack I'd learned to balance while walking through each day. Zane started coming over on Thursdays to watch basketball games, and we'd order Chinese food, but he stopped trying to fix everything or apologize every 5 minutes like he did those first few months. He'd set up clear rules for himself, like texting before coming over and not staying past 10 and not bringing up Jasper unless I did first, which helped us find something that felt almost normal again. The prison called one afternoon while I was sorting through medical bills, and the voice on the other end told me Jasper had been attacked by another inmate and was in the infirmary with broken ribs and a fractured jaw. I hung up without asking if he was okay and went back to sorting papers, waiting to feel something, anything, but there was just this empty space where caring used to live. My boss pulled me aside the next week and offered me a transfer to the marketing department in the East Building where nobody knew my story, and I wouldn't have to see the break room where Sloan used to eat lunch or walk past Jasper's old office every day. I packed my desk that Friday and moved everything to a cubicle with a window view of the parking lot instead of the courtyard where we used to eat lunch together. Elise convinced me to meet someone for coffee. Just coffee, she said, with a guy from her book club who knew my situation but wanted to meet anyway. I lasted 20 minutes before making an excuse about a work emergency because his cologne reminded me of of the aftershave Jasper wore to our wedding, and I threw up in the restaurant bathroom before driving home. The lawyer called while I was planting tomatoes in my new garden bed to say the civil suit settled for $75,000 that I'd probably never see, but at least there was a legal document saying Jasper could never contact me again even after prison. I bought 4 small trees from the nursery and planted them along the back fence, one for each baby, writing their names on river rocks I placed at the base of each trunk. Phoenix got the apple tree because we'd talked about picking apples with our kids someday. Sage got the oak for strength. Indigo got the cherry tree for beauty, and Xavier got the maple because fall was when we'd tried the hardest for him. I watered them every morning before work and pulled weeds on weekends, and sometimes sat on the grass between them, reading pregnancy loss books Elise brought me. A reporter from the state paper left 3 voicemails about doing a feature story on reproductive coercion and insurance fraud, but I deleted them without calling back because I didn't want to be the cautionary tale in someone's Sunday morning coffee reading. The anniversary came on a Tuesday, and I took the day off work to sit in my garden with the trees that were starting to show new growth, and realized I'd survived something that should have destroyed me completely. I wasn't grateful for finding strength I never wanted to need, and I wasn't proud of surviving something that never should have happened. But I was still here, still breathing, still getting up each morning to water 4 trees and go to work, and sometimes even laugh at Zane's terrible jokes during basketball games. The poison Jasper fed me for 2 years hadn't killed me, even though it killed our babies, and some days that felt like its own kind of victory, even if it was one I never wanted to win. Really appreciate you hanging out with me today. It's been fascinating to just explore and wonder about all this together. Hope to catch you again soon. Like the video, it helps more than you think.